So I wanted to give you an absolutely nutshell version of the story of the Arab-Israeli conflict from 1880 to 1945. And to start, we're going to look at a map of Europe here from 1880, and we see each of those circles representing the population of Jews in those respective countries. And you can see the vast majority of Jews are living in Russia and in Poland and Austria-Hungary in 1880. Now, in 1881, Russia is going to suffer an assassination of its Tsar, Alexander II. Alexander II was seen as a reformist Tsar, and in many cases was actually good for the Jewish population in Russia. But his assassination will lead to a rollback of all those reforms and a new era of persecution of Russian Jews. This era of persecution is going to lead millions of Russian and Eastern European Jews to flee their homelands. The vast majority of them will head to Western Europe and ultimately the United States. But a few thousand will ultimately head to the land of Palestine, which at this time, of course, is a part of the Ottoman Empire. In Eastern Europe, or pardon me, in Western Europe, Theodor Herzl will come out as a leading voice for the movement of Western European Jews to Palestine with his publication of The Jewish State, which made the argument that no matter where Jews would move in Europe or even the United States, that they would, as he said, take the seeds of anti-Semitism with them, and that they ultimately needed a homeland, a state of their own, where nobody in that state would be persecuted for being Jewish. And Theodor Herzl advocated that this should be in the land of Palestine, currently held by the Ottoman Empire. This was pushed along by Theodor Herzl's eyewitness account of the Dreyfus Affair in France, where a Jewish French military officer was accused of espionage, and France would see, and Paris would see, a spike of anti-Semitic behavior in the aftermath. So Herzl saw that he would never see true emancipation for the Jews in Western Europe. They would need a home of their own, and this ultimately became the Zionist movement. Now, as we fast forward to World War I, we can see that the Ottoman Empire is in control of the Middle East and in control of this area of Palestine. And Britain, in 1914, is in control of Egypt and its important waterway of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is crucial for British trade and also during the war effort for getting troops from India and Australia and New Zealand into the war via the Red Sea and the Suez Canal without having to go all the way around Africa. During the war, Britain obviously has their main focus of attention in Western Europe, in Belgium and France. But they also have to keep an eye on the Suez Canal and keep that safe. As the Ottoman Empire makes moves into the Sinai Peninsula, Britain has got to fight in the Middle East, but they just can't devote the resources to do that. So Britain will make a series of agreements with a few parties in order to hold on to the Middle East and ultimately defeat the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. The first comes in the form of a series of letters between Hussein Ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, who is kind of seen as the de facto leader of Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, and Henry McMahon, a British official. Through these letters, the Sharif of Mecca is promised the creation of an Arab kingdom in turn for his support of an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, which ultimately does come. This is a photo of T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia. He's the British officer that's assigned to this Arab revolt to help organize and train and equip them in their fight. A year later, the Hussein McMahon correspondence were through 1915. In 1916, the French and the British will meet and sign what's called the SykesPicot Agreement, where the French and the British will agree to divide up the territory, the Middle Eastern territory of the Ottoman Empire, between themselves in the aftermath of this war. And finally, a third agreement in the form of the Balfour Declaration is made by the British government to the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Zionist Organization. And the Balfour Declaration promises the British government's support of the establishment in Palestine of a homeland for the Jewish people. This was done for a number of reasons, but most important would be the hope that Jewish Americans might be able to write letters to their congressmen and have some influence in getting the United States involved faster in World War I. And also Jewish Russians who have some positions in this provisional government of Alexander Kerensky after the ousting of the Tsar. Possibly Jewish Russians could help keep their country in the war for longer. So Britain made 3 agreements with 3 peoples, 3 entities And unfortunately for those three entities, these agreements cannot all be kept at the same time. Now, of course, the British and the Allies win World War I, and in the aftermath of the war, a peace treaty will be worked out in Paris. This is Faisal ibn Hussein. He's the son of the Sharif of Mecca, who goes to Versailles, and you can see Lawrence of Arabia actually standing over his left shoulder. He goes to Versailles in hopes of making the argument that the Arab people, as promised in the Hussein McMahon correspondence, should have their rights to self-determination. But of course, the French and the British leading the discussions are not going to allow for that. An independent Arabia will be had, but it's going to be in merely the Arabian Peninsula, while the rest of the Arab lands in the Middle East will be divvied up between Syria and between Britain, as much as was discussed in the SykesPicot Agreement. And we can actually see here, I will overlay a map of the SykesPicot Agreement over these new territories to be ceded to the British and French, and you can see it's almost exactly the same. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement is largely met, while the Hussein McMahon correspondence is certainly not going to be, and the Arabs will be left out. So the ultimate decision as to what to do with these territories is to create what's known as the League of Nations mandate system, where Britain and France will take control of these newly gained territories in the form of mandates, where they are responsible for fostering the development of these territories into viable states on their own. And when they are viable states on their own, Britain and France are to leave them to their own independence. France will take over the mandate of Syria, you can see there on the north, while Britain will take over the two mandates of Palestine, which on this map include both Palestine and Transjordan, and Iraq. Now, obviously, you can imagine the Arabs are quite perturbed at this. In Iraq, Arabs calling for their own independence will protest British rule, and in Syria, Abdullah ibn Hussein, the son here, seen on the right, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, will lead an army of Arabs to battle the French in Damascus for control of that. Now, this is absolutely what the British do not want. The British want peace in the Middle East. The British don't want to have to devote resources to the Middle East. So their solution is going to be to establish Faisal as the king of Iraq. And once the Iraq mandate gets its independence, the first king of Iraq will be King Faisal I. And Abdullah will be granted Transjordan. And if we look back at the previous map, we can see that there's a line going to be drawn between Palestine and Jordan to create another mandate out of that. So now the British now have three mandates: Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. Abdullah will be put in Amman, Jordan, to be the future leader of Jordan. Faisal will be put in Baghdad to be the future leader of Iraq. And the British will maintain control of Palestine, which now has an ever-growing population of Jews moving to the British mandate of Palestine in the aftermath of the Balfour Declaration and the promise that the British would work to create a homeland for Jews in Palestine. Now, as the Jews are moving to Palestine in greater numbers, there will be some controversy. Arab populations in Palestine are going to begin to find themselves displaced or possibly losing their homes or the land that they had previously lived on. They might have been renting land, for example, from absentee owners who decided to sell it to Jewish interests, and when Jewish populations arrived, the Arabs would be moved off their land. So there's going to be some frustration and some arguments and ultimately riots that are going to break out between Arab populations and the Jewish populations in Palestine. These will largely be solved by the British government proclaiming both at the same time their support for the Balfour Declaration and its terms, but also for the idea that the percentage of Jews that are moving into Palestine cannot disrupt the economic balance of the state and should not disenfranchise Arabs. While this is all going on, the Jews of Palestine are going to begin to work on creating a state within a state with the formation of what's known as the Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency is the representative body of Jews in Palestine, eventually led by this man David Ben-Gurion, who will later be the first prime minister of an independent Israel. So the Jews in Palestine are going to begin to create institutions of a state. They'll also establish what's known as the Haganah, which is a paramilitary force, defense force for Israeli settlements and the Jewish agency, which will eventually evolve into the Israeli Defense Forces. Arab populations aren't going to be as successful in organizing governmental institutions, as there's a lot of division within the Arab population as to who should be the leadership, and ultimately the Arabs will refuse to join into a British-supported civil government that would have required them to accept the provisions of the Balfour Declaration. David Ben-Gurion and his left-wing labor Zionists are not the only political movement in town. This is Zeev Jabotinsky, and he's a leader of a political party known as the Revisionists in Israel. The Revisionists in Palestine had hopes of revising the line that Winston Churchill initially drew through Palestine, creating those two mandates, essentially creating Palestine and Jordan. Zeev Jabotinsky and his revisionists, when they heard the British government say that the Jews were to have a homeland in Palestine, they saw that as all of Palestine. And they're going to be prominent within the right wing of Israeli politics through the Mandate period and through the early years. Now, the greatest riot, the largest riot that would happen between Arabs and Palestinians in the 1920s comes in 1929, what are known as the Western Wall riots or the Al-Barak riots, where Arabs protested the establishment of barricades, some fences and gates and chairs at the Western Wall. Their understanding was that there should have been no construction, permanent or temporary, at the Western Wall. So fears over future access to the wall will lead to the greatest riot that the Palestine Mandate would see, and upwards of 300 Arabs and Jews will be killed during this. The British response to these riots, once again, is to quell the disturbance, but then issue another white paper in which the British announce that it's Arabs being disenfranchised economically and through their homes by ever-growing Jewish populations migrating to the area. That's part of the problem. This will, of course, in turn frustrate the Jewish populations that believe that the Balfour Declaration still stands and that the British should be supporting the creation of a homeland for Jews in Palestine, which means Jews will move to Palestine to create a homeland. The British responded to this with another letter to the Jews, affirming their continued support for the Balfour Declaration. You can see from this chart of Jewish immigration to Palestine, the second column of numbers there represents, you can see here, the second column of numbers there represents the number of Jews migrating to Palestine. In the late 1920s, that number is relatively low, but in 1933 we're going to see a dramatic escalation in that number, with 30,000 Jews in 1933 moving to Palestine, 42,000 in 1934, 62,000 in 35, 30,000 in 1936. This is known as the fifth Aliyah, the fifth movement of Jews to Palestine, and it corresponds with the arrival of the Nazi regime in Germany. So with the rise to power of the Nazis, tens of thousands more Jews will flee Palestine, or flee Europe and head to Palestine. This is going to cause even greater strain with the Arab population in Palestine, and in 1936, the beginning of the Arab Revolt. Not to be confused with the Arab Revolt of World War I that had the Arab populations helping the British oust the Ottoman rule. This is the Arab Revolt of 1936, in which the Arabs were rising against British rule in opposition to this great migration of Jews to Palestine. The British will attempt to get to the bottom of the Arab Revolt and hopefully solve it with the release of what's known as the Peel Commission Report. The Peel Commission Report called for the division of Palestine into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state that you can see here, with important religious sites, especially important Christian religious sites, being kept in a mandated territory controlled by Britain. The Jewish state in the north has got prime coastal areas and also prime agricultural areas, while the Arab state, though larger, encompasses that southern Negev desert, where there's simply not going to be a lot going on. Then comes World War II. And World War II, and the questions of World War II will ultimately have a dramatic impact on this story. In 1939, in hopes of ending this this Arab revolt, and after seeing that the Arabs would not accept the Peel Commission report, as they don't see giving any territory up as being necessary or being right, the British issue yet another white paper. In the 1939 white paper, the British government will set actual hard limits on the number of Jews that can migrate to Palestine. 1939, of course, Britain has got other things to deal with, namely the growing tensions in Europe. Remember, 1938 was the year of the Munich Pact that Hitler would quickly violate. By 1939, a line is drawn in the sand at Poland. Britain and France are arming for war that they believe now may actually come. The last thing Britain needs is a disturbance in its Palestine mandate. So Britain in 1939 issues a white paper, another white paper, which will limit the immigration of Jews to Palestine, which puts the Jews in Palestine in an interesting position, because the white paper is going to keep them from continuing to build their homeland, yet the country that's issued the white paper is Britain, which by 1940 is the only country in Europe that's now actively fighting against the Nazis who are persecuting the Jews. So the Jewish response to this will be to, quote, fight the war as if there's no white paper and fight the white paper as if there's no war. So the Jews will be absolutely supportive of the British war effort in World War II, but within Palestine, they will be absolutely supportive of violating the limits on migration that the white paper of 1939 sets. This will have a couple of tragic turns in the form of a couple refugee boats, ships that had arrived in Palestine from Europe carrying Jewish refugees, where the some Israelis attempted to disable the ships by setting off small charges around the engine room, ultimately led to the sinking of these ships and the death of hundreds of Jews. During the course of the war, the Holocaust will kill two-thirds of the world, two-thirds of European Jews and one-third of global Jews. And when the realities of the Holocaust are released to the world, global sympathy will go out for the Jewish people, and there will be a further push for Jewish homeland in Palestine, and many more Jews will begin to move to Palestine. So there we have it, a quick Cliff Notes version of the Arab-Israeli conflict up through World War II. From here on out, everything we discuss in class and everything you will see on these podcasts will be fair game for the IB examination. Take care, everybody.